The rain poured relentlessly that evening, blurring the city lights outside my tiny apartment window. I sat there staring at my reflection in the glass, a man who had given everything, yet somehow still wasn't enough. My name is Ethan Cole, a mechanic who spent most of his life covered in grease and dreams that once had her in them. Claire Donovan, the girl who made even the simplest moments feel like poetry. We met 3 years ago when her car broke down near my workshop. I still remember how she smiled, soft, warm, with that kind of brightness that makes you believe in better days. I fixed her car and she, unknowingly, fixed something in me. From coffee dates to late-night drives, we built something real. Something I thought money could never touch, but I was wrong. Her world was different. Expensive restaurants, elegant dresses, weekend trips to places I could only see on postcards. I tried to fit in, tried to give her more than I had, but every attempt just reminded me of what I lacked. I began taking extra shifts, skipping meals, saving every dollar, thinking love could outweigh luxury. The breaking point came one evening when she looked at me with tired eyes and said, "Ethan, can't live like this forever." Her words shattered something deep inside me. I realized in that moment that love wasn't enough. Not for her. Not for the world she came from. And so I watched her walk away into a life I could never afford, leaving behind the man who would have given her everything, except wealth. Ethan had always believed that love was the great equalizer, that when two hearts beat in sync, the world around them faded away. And for a while that belief felt true. When Claire came into his life, she didn't seem to care that his hands were rough from long hours in the garage, or that his clothes smelled faintly of oil and metal. She laughed at his jokes, shared stories about her work in marketing, and listened when he spoke about his dreams of opening his own auto shop someday. It felt like they were building something pure, something untouched by the expectations of the world. Their love grew naturally, as if it had been waiting to happen. Ethan would pick her up after work, his old Chevy humming beneath the city lights. They'd grab coffee at a small cafe she loved, one that looked far too elegant for his budget, but she always insisted on paying half. She said it wasn't about money, that what mattered was how he made her feel safe, seen and grounded. And Ethan, with all his heart, believed her. He thought she saw him, not his wallet. But as weeks turned into months, the subtle cracks began to form. Claire's friends, who came from families with vacation homes and sleek European cars, would sometimes join them. Ethan could feel their polite smiles, the way their eyes lingered on his worn-out jacket, or the grease under his nails that never quite washed off. They didn't say much, just little things that sliced through him like invisible knives. "You're really passionate about what you do, huh?" one of them said with a faint smirk. "It's great to see someone who still works with their hands." Claire would laugh it off, squeeze Ethan's hand under the table, but he saw the faint blush of embarrassment on her cheeks. It wasn't her fault, he told himself. Their worlds were just different. She had grown up in one filled with polished silver and ballroom lights, while his was lit by the warm glow of garage bulbs and the sound of engines humming late into the night. He tried to bridge that gap with effort, with love. He'd save up for weeks to take her to one of the fancy restaurants her friends liked, pretending not to flinch when the bill arrived. She'd thank him, call him sweet, and promise next time they'd just go somewhere simple. But simple never lasted long. Her life had a rhythm, one set to the tempo of success and luxury, and Ethan was always a step behind. Her parents had been kind at first, though their politeness had a certain chill beneath it. The first time he met them, Claire's father shook his hand firmly, but looked him in the eye with the sort of quiet assessment reserved for people who didn't quite belong. "Mechanic, you said?" he asked casually during dinner, as if confirming a rumor. Ethan nodded, proud of what he did. "That's honest work," the man said after a pause, his smile thin. Claire's mother, meanwhile, kept the conversation going, asking Ethan about his hobbies, his plans, his future. When he mentioned saving up to open his own workshop, she smiled gently and said, "That's lovely, dear. Everyone starts somewhere." Ethan tried not to let it bother him, but he could feel the distance growing, not between him and Claire, but between him and the world she came from. She tried to reassure him, often saying, "I don't care what they think, Ethan, I love you." And she meant it, at least at first. She loved how simple things felt with him, how he wasn't obsessed with social status or appearances. She said his world was peaceful, real. But the truth was, reality is easier to romanticize when you can step in and out of it at will. As their first anniversary approached, Ethan wanted to do something special. He spent weeks fixing up an old car, painting it himself, and taking Claire on a drive through the countryside. They stopped by a lake, the sunset painting everything in shades of gold and orange. It was beautiful, quiet, and for a while she looked at him the way she used to, with pure affection. But when he mentioned one day buying a small piece of land nearby, opening his own garage there, she smiled faintly, but didn't answer. Later, when they stopped for dinner at a modest diner, she seemed distracted scrolling through her phone, liking pictures of her friends at rooftop bars and weekend getaways. Ethan noticed, but he didn't say anything. He was too afraid that if he pointed it out, the fragile illusion of their shared world would crumble. Instead, he told her he'd do better. He promised himself he'd find a way to give her everything she deserved. But deep down, a quiet ache began to take root. A fear that maybe love wasn't enough to bridge the distance between two worlds that never truly. Things grew more complicated when Claire's work began to take her into circles filled with wealth and ambition. She started attending company events, fundraisers, and networking dinners. Ethan was proud of her. She was smart, driven, and beautiful. But every story she shared seemed to come from a world farther from his reach. "You should have seen the hotel, Ethan," she'd say excitedly. It was incredible. The view from the top floor was unreal. He'd listen, smile, and nod, but each word felt like a reminder that he couldn't give her that kind of life. The comments from her friends grew sharper, cloaked in politeness. "Claire, you could do so much better," one of them whispered when they thought Ethan couldn't hear. "He's sweet, but he's not really your type, is he?" Claire defended him at first, but over time she began to withdraw from those moments, to change the subject instead of confronting them. Ethan pretended not to notice, though every silence felt heavier than words. There were still good days, moments when everything felt right. They'd sit on the hood of his car, sharing takeout under the stars, laughing about nothing. She'd lean against him and say she didn't need anything else. And maybe she believed that, for that hour, for that night. But the next morning she'd wake up to a different reality, one where her friends posted pictures from lavish brunches and expensive vacations, and Ethan's world felt smaller, dimmer in comparison. Ethan could feel the shift coming long before she ever said a word. It was in the way she stopped reaching for his hand in public, the way her laughter dimmed when he surprised her with something small. It was in her silence when people asked how they met, her hesitation when he mentioned the future. He tried to convince himself that love was enough, that no matter what the world said, they had something real. But love, he was learning, doesn't always survive the quiet erosion of pride and perception. Sometimes it drowns not in hatred or betrayal, but in the slow, painful realization that the world you want to share is built on uneven ground. And Ethan, though he didn't know it yet, was standing on the side destined to fall. Ethan's life began to revolve around the idea of more. More hours, more effort, more sacrifice. The moment he felt Claire slipping away, he convinced himself that the solution lay in money, that if he could just give her a better life, the kind of life she was used to, everything would fall back into place. It wasn't about greed or pride. It was about fear. The fear of losing the only person who ever made him feel like he was enough. He started working extra shifts at the garage. His boss, a gruff old man named Rick, noticed. "You trying to kill yourself, kid?" he asked one night as Ethan wiped the sweat from his forehead. "You've been here 12 hours straight." Ethan forced a smile. "Just trying to save up," he said. Rick shrugged. "For a ring?" he teased. Ethan didn't answer, but the silence said everything. The days blurred together. Ethan would wake before sunrise, his hands already aching from the day before. He'd skip breakfast, grab a coffee on the go, and throw himself into work. Engines, tires, transmissions. His life became a rhythm of metal and motion. Every dollar he earned felt like a step closer to keeping her. Every hour he worked was a small price for love. He didn't tell Claire about the overtime. He didn't want her to worry, or worse, to pity him. When they went out, he made sure she never saw how carefully he counted his bills before choosing where to eat. He bought her small gifts, nothing extravagant, just thoughtful things. A bracelet he saw in a shop window, a book she once mentioned loving as a child. She smiled, said thank you, but the light in her eyes dimmed a little more each time. She didn't mean to make him feel small, but her world was growing faster than his could follow. Her job was taking off. Promotions, projects, meetings with clients who wore tailored suits and drove cars worth more than his entire workshop. She'd tell him about these dinners, the ones at rooftop restaurants where the city stretched endlessly below. "You'd love the view," she said one night, her eyes distant. "You should come with me sometime." He nodded, but deep down he knew he wouldn't fit in. He could already hear the quiet judgments, see the way people would look at him. The idea of embarrassing her made his stomach twist, so instead of going out, he doubled down on his work. He started taking small loans to buy better tools for the garage, hoping he could increase his earnings. "Invest in yourself," Rick had said once. But the interest piled up faster than the profits. Ethan didn't care. He believed it would all be worth it, that once he could afford a decent apartment, a better car, and maybe an engagement ring, Claire would look at him the way she used to. But the more he worked, the less time they had together. Their late-night drives turned into quick phone calls. Their laughter-filled evenings were replaced by text messages that grew shorter every week. "I miss you," he'd write. Sometimes she'd reply right away, sometimes hours later. "I miss you too. Work's crazy lately." He believed her, or at least tried to. One Friday night, he surprised her at her apartment with takeout from her favorite Thai place. She opened the door in an elegant dress, her hair done perfectly. "Ethan?" she said, surprised. "I thought you were working late." He smiled, holding up the food. "I got off early. Thought we could have dinner." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. "I'm actually heading out. It's a work thing. I didn't think you'd be home this early." His heart sank, but he forced a grin. "It's fine, another time." That another time kept getting pushed further away. As the weeks passed, Ethan began noticing things he couldn't ignore. Her perfume smelled different. Her tone, once soft and playful, had grown distant, polite. When they met, she seemed distracted, always half present, her mind somewhere else. He told himself it was stress, that she was just tired from work. But every time she spoke about her new clients or the people she met at events, her voice held a kind of excitement that she no longer had when she spoke to him. Still, Ethan refused to give up. He took out another small loan, bought a sleek watch, and rented a suit to take her out to a fancy dinner for her birthday. He remembered sitting across from her, watching her in the glow of the candlelight, thinking how perfect she looked, and how out of place he felt. The waiter poured wine he couldn't pronounce, and Ethan nodded along, pretending to understand. When the bill came, he smiled and handed over his card, praying silently it wouldn't decline. It went through, and he let out a quiet sigh of relief. Later that night, as he walked her home, she said, "You didn't have to do all this." He smiled. "You deserve it." But she shook her head, her voice gentle. "Ethan, you don't need to prove anything. I like simple things, remember?" He wanted to believe her, but he could see the doubt in her eyes, a flicker of guilt, maybe even pity. After that, he started hiding his exhaustion from her. He'd show up with a smile, pretending everything was fine, even as his debts grew and his body ached. There were nights he'd fall asleep at the garage, too tired to drive home. Rick found him one morning slumped over his workbench. "You're pushing too hard, kid," he said quietly. "You'll lose yourself before you gain anything." Ethan laughed it off, but the words stayed with him. One evening, he caught sight of himself in the mirror, dark circles under his eyes, grease stains that no soap could wash away, and a hollowness that hadn't been there before. He looked like a man fighting a battle he was already losing. Still, he kept going, because love, he thought, was supposed to be worth it. But no matter how hard he tried, he could feel Claire slipping further away. Their conversations became routine. "How was your day?" "Busy. When can I see you?" "Soon. I miss you." "Me too." Words without weight. Promises without time. One night, after another long day, Ethan called her just to hear her voice. She didn't pick up. He tried again, then a third time. Nothing. He left a message, his voice breaking just a little. "Hey, I just wanted to talk. Miss you. Call me when you can." She didn't call back that night. Or the next. When she finally did, her tone was soft, distant. "Ethan, I'm sorry. Things have been crazy lately. Maybe we should take a little break. Just for a while." His heart stopped. "A break?" "Just until things settle," she said. "I need some time to think." He sat in silence, the weight of his sacrifices pressing down on him. All those extra hours, all the sleepless nights, every dollar borrowed, every dream postponed, and it still wasn't enough. In that moment, he realized something he'd been running from all along. He could give her everything he had, but it would never be everything she wanted. After their so-called break, Ethan tried to convince himself it was temporary, that Claire just needed space, that she'd come back once she realized what they had was real. He replayed every memory in his head, every laugh, every late-night drive, trying to find where things had gone wrong. But no matter how many times he went over it, one truth kept echoing. Love wasn't the problem. The world they lived in was. Claire's messages grew fewer, her voice colder whenever she called. The warmth that used to melt through the line was gone, replaced by a distant politeness that made his heart ache. "How are you?" she'd ask softly, as if speaking to a stranger. "I'm fine," he'd reply, always trying to sound stronger than he felt. But deep down, he knew he was fading from her life like an old photograph, and still there, but barely visible. Then came the day he saw her. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Ethan had just left the bank after making another payment on the loan he'd taken. He was exhausted, his shirt clinging to him from the heat, his mind buzzing with worry. As he passed a downtown cafe, he caught sight of her sitting by the window. For a split second, his heart leapt, until he noticed she wasn't alone. A man sat across from her, sharply dressed, the kind of man whose confidence seemed effortless. He leaned forward as she laughed, that same laugh that once belonged to Ethan. Her hand rested lightly on the table, and though it didn't touch his, it hovered close enough to sting. Ethan froze, the world around him falling silent. He stood there for a moment too long, his reflection staring back at him through the glass. A tired man in grease-stained clothes looking at the woman who used to love him. He didn't go inside. He couldn't. Instead, he walked away, his chest tight, his thoughts screaming. He wanted to believe it was a work meeting, a friendly lunch, anything but what it looked like. But deep down he knew. He'd felt her slipping away, and now he was watching her drift into another life, one he couldn't compete with. That night, he sat in his apartment, staring at the untouched dinner he'd made. His phone lay silent on the table. He thought about calling her, about asking her who the man was, but the fear of hearing the truth kept him still. Instead, he poured himself a drink, his first in months, and whispered to the empty room, "She deserves better." "Doesn't she?" Days turned into weeks. Claire's updates became rare, her excuses more polished. "Sorry, busy with work," she'd say. "It's been hectic." He tried to play along, to act like he understood, but every word she said felt like another wall between them. Then one evening, when she finally agreed to meet him, Ethan saw how much had changed. She arrived at the cafe 15 minutes late, wearing a tailored dress that made her look like she'd stepped out of a magazine. Ethan stood when she entered, his heart pounding. "Hey," he said, forcing a smile. She smiled back, politely, distantly. When she sat down, he noticed the way she avoided his eyes, how her hands fidgeted with the edge of her phone. "I've missed you," he said quietly. "I've missed you too," she replied automatically. But her voice lacked conviction. They talked, or at least tried to. She spoke about work, new projects, events she'd attended. He listened, nodding, trying to sound supportive. But when he asked about her weekend, she hesitated. "I went out with some friends," she said finally. "Just dinner." "Anyone I know?" he asked. She smiled faintly, that careful smile that always came when she was hiding something. "No, just people from work." Ethan's stomach twisted, but he said nothing. He didn't want to be the jealous boyfriend, the insecure one. So, he kept quiet, even as his heart screamed that something wasn't right. Over the next few weeks, the distance only grew. She stopped calling altogether, her replies to his messages coming hours or even days later. Each time she had a reason, A meeting, a deadline, exhaustion. And every time he believed her a little less. One night he decided to go for a walk. The air was cold, sharp, biting at his skin. He passed the park where they'd once spent hours just talking, dreaming about the future. He stopped by the old bench where she'd once fallen asleep on his shoulder. The memories felt cruel now, like ghosts that refused to leave him alone. He thought about turning back, but something pulled him forward. A gut instinct, a quiet dread he couldn't shake. Her company was hosting a networking event at a nearby hotel that evening. She'd mentioned it weeks ago. He wasn't sure what he expected to find, but his feet moved before his mind could stop them. When he reached the hotel, he stayed across the street, hidden in the shadows. The entrance glittered with chandeliers and expensive cars. And then he saw her, stepping out of a sleek black sedan, wearing a dress that shimmered under the lights. She was laughing again, that effortless laugh he used to know so well, and beside her was the same man from the cafe, his hand resting lightly on her back as they walked inside. Ethan stood there, numb. He wanted to feel angry, betrayed, but all he felt was hollow. He had given everything he had to love her, every ounce of his strength, every drop of his hope, and still it wasn't enough, not because he didn't love her deeply, but because love couldn't fill the gap between his world and hers. When he got home that night, he sat in silence for hours. His phone buzzed, a message from her. "Hope you're doing okay. We'll talk soon." The words stung more than any goodbye could have. They were polite, careful, and final. He didn't respond. He couldn't. The next morning, he went to work as usual, his eyes hollow but his hands steady. Rick noticed but didn't ask. There were no words that could fix what had already broken. Ethan poured his pain into his work, his movements mechanical, his thoughts somewhere else entirely. Claire stopped calling after that. She didn't owe him an explanation, at least not one she was willing to give. But Ethan had already found his answer. Love, he realized, isn't always taken from you. Sometimes it simply fades away, replaced by something shinier, easier, safer. Weeks later, he heard through a mutual friend that Claire was seeing someone new, a man from her company, the same one he'd seen that night. He sat quietly when he heard it, staring at the floor, a strange calm settling over him. He didn't cry. He'd already done that silently, in the moments between hope and heartbreak. He told himself she deserved happiness, even if it wasn't with him. But as he closed the garage that night and walked home alone under the streetlights, he couldn't help but wonder if love was ever meant to survive a world obsessed with wealth and status. Maybe he had been naive to believe that being enough for her heart would ever outweigh not being enough for her world. The night Ethan discovered the truth began like any other, quiet, heavy, and uncertain. It had been 2 months since Claire had drifted out of his daily life, leaving behind only fragmented conversations and the faint illusion that things might still be okay. He'd learned to live in that silence, to tell himself that maybe she just needed time. But deep down, a part of him already knew the truth he didn't want to face. That evening, he was closing up the garage when he got a message from one of his co-workers, Jake. "Hey man, you still seeing that girl, Claire?" The text read. Ethan frowned. "Yeah, why?" he replied, though even as he typed it, his chest tightened. A few seconds later, Jake sent back a photo. It wasn't a clear one, taken from across the street, but Ethan recognized her instantly. Claire, dressed in an elegant black dress, her arm loosely linked with a man in a tailored gray suit. They were walking out of a restaurant that Ethan could never afford to step foot in. The caption underneath read simply, "Sorry, man." Ethan stared at the picture for a long time, his hands trembling. His throat went dry, and the room seemed to tilt around him. He wanted to tell himself it meant nothing, that maybe it was a business dinner, that Jake had misunderstood. But deep down, something inside him broke. That picture was the confirmation his heart had been denying for weeks. The quiet voice that whispered she's already gone was right all along. He didn't go home that night. He just drove. The city blurred past him, lights streaking across the windshield like ghosts. Every corner reminded him of her. The cafe they used to sit at, the park where she laughed until she cried, the diner where she once said she didn't care about money or status. Lies, beautiful, comforting lies. By the time he reached her apartment building, it was almost midnight. He sat in his truck for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, his heartbeat echoing in his ears. He didn't know what he was going to say. He didn't even know if he wanted to see her, but he couldn't let it end with silence. He needed to know, once and for all, what he'd been fighting for, and what he'd lost. When he finally gathered the courage to go inside, the hallway lights felt too bright. He climbed the stairs, each step heavier than the last, until he reached her door. For a moment he just stood there, listening. There were voices, hers soft and familiar, and another deeper one that didn't belong to him. Laughter followed, muffled but unmistakable. That sound cut through him more deeply than any argument ever could. He knocked. The voices stopped. There was a brief silence, then the sound of footsteps approaching. The door opened slightly, and there she was, Claire, startled, eyes wide, wearing the same black dress from the photo. Behind her, Ethan caught a glimpse of the man from the picture setting down 2 wine glasses on the coffee table. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. He didn't say anything for a long time. He just looked at her, memorizing her face, her guilt, the way she couldn't meet his eyes. "I saw you," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "I saw you with him." She closed her eyes, exhaling as if releasing something she'd been holding in for weeks. "Ethan, it's not what you think," she started, but he cut her off. "Then tell me what it is," he said, his voice rising just slightly, not in anger but in pain. "Tell me why you stopped calling, why you've been lying, why you're standing here with him right now." Her eyes glistened with unshed tears. "I didn't mean for you to find out like this." "Then how was I supposed to?" he asked bitterly. "Was I supposed to just fade out of your life quietly? Pretend it didn't matter?" Claire stepped aside slightly, embarrassed, as if shielding the man behind her from the confrontation. "Ethan, please, not here. This isn't fair." "Fair?" Ethan repeated, a hollow laugh escaping his lips. "You talk about fair while I've been breaking myself trying to be enough for you. I worked extra shifts. I took loans. I've been killing myself thinking love was enough. And you're telling me about fair?" Her lips trembled, but she said nothing. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she whispered, "You're a good man, Ethan, you really are." "But I can't do this anymore." He blinked, not fully processing her words. "Can't do what?" "Live like this," she said, her voice cracking. "Always worrying about bills, about the future. I want stability, Ethan. Security. I need to think about my life, my future." Her words landed like blows, each one sharper than the last. "And you couldn't have told me that?" he asked quietly. She looked down. "I didn't want to hurt you." He stepped back slightly, shaking his head. "You already did." The man behind her finally spoke. "Maybe it's better if you go, man." Ethan's eyes snapped toward him, cold and sharp. "You don't get to talk," he said flatly. The man took a step back, muttering something under his breath, but Ethan ignored him. His focus was on Claire. "You said love was enough," he said softly. "You said we'd figure it out together." "I wanted to believe that," she whispered. "But love doesn't pay for the life I want." The words were honest, brutal, and final. Ethan stood there for a moment, staring at her, the woman he'd once thought he'd spend his life with. The silence between them was filled with everything they'd lost. The laughter, the hope, the small dreams that now felt foolish. He wanted to hate her, but all he felt was an aching sadness. She wasn't cruel. She was just someone who'd chosen comfort over love. He nodded slowly, his voice barely a whisper. "I hope he gives you everything you're looking for." She opened her mouth to speak, but he turned and walked away before she could. His steps echoed down the hallway, each one heavier than the last, until he reached the cool night air outside. He didn't cry. The pain was too deep for tears, settling instead like a weight in his chest that made it hard to breathe. When he got back to his truck, he sat in silence for a long time, staring at his hands. They were calloused, rough, proof of years of hard work. The kind of hands that built things, fixed things. But love, he realized, wasn't something he could repair, not this time. The next morning he went to work as usual. He said nothing to anyone, just buried himself in the rhythm of the garage. The clanging of tools, the hum of engines, the smell of oil and sweat. But inside, something in him had gone quiet. The hope that once drove him had burned out, leaving only the ashes of what might have been. That night, when he finally lay down to sleep, Claire's words replayed in his head again and again. "I need stability, not struggle." He whispered into the dark. "Then you never really loved me." It wasn't anger anymore, it was acceptance. A quiet, broken kind of understanding. Because in the end, Ethan realized that sometimes love isn't lost because it dies. Sometimes it's abandoned because the world convinces people that love without wealth isn't enough to live on. And that was the night he finally let her go. Not because he wanted to, but because she already had. After that night, Ethan's world became a blur of motion and silence. He went through his days like a man on autopilot, working, sleeping, and repeating, as if keeping busy could drown out the echo of her words. "I need stability, not struggle." Those 6 words replayed in his head like a broken record, cutting deeper each time. He had never thought of himself as poor until she made him feel like he was. He had always been proud of what he did. Honest work, hard-earned money. But now every greasy rag, every dented wrench, every dollar he counted felt like a reminder of what he lacked. The first few weeks after Claire left were the hardest. He'd wake up expecting her texts, checking his phone before even getting out of bed, hoping that maybe she'd changed her mind. But the phone stayed silent. No good morning, no miss you, not even a simple how are you. Just silence, cold, deliberate silence. He'd go to the garage, bury himself in repairs, and come home long after sunset. The apartment felt emptier than ever. The coffee mug she used still sat in the cupboard. Her laughter still echoed faintly in the walls. But the warmth was gone. Sometimes, late at night, he'd find himself driving past her neighborhood, his headlights sweeping across the street like a ghost searching for something already gone. He knew it was pathetic, but part of him couldn't help it. He needed to see her world, the one he could never belong to. The lights in her building glowed softly, like stars he'd never reach. Once he even saw her on the balcony, laughing into her phone, a glass of wine in her hand. She looked radiant, free. For a moment he wondered if she ever thought about him, or if he was just another chapter she'd closed. At the garage, Rick noticed the change in him. "You're here, but you're not," he said one afternoon, wiping his hands on a rag. "You can't fix people like you fix cars, kid. Some things ain't meant to be repaired." Ethan didn't respond. He just nodded and went back to work, his silence saying more than words could. Weeks turned into months, and slowly, the pain dulled. Not because it disappeared, but because he got used to carrying it. He started staying late at work, not for money this time, but because he didn't want to go home. The quiet there reminded him of everything he'd lost. Instead, he poured himself into his craft, working harder, learning new techniques, taking on more clients. Somewhere along the line, that pain began to transform into something else: drive. Ethan began taking on private repair jobs on weekends, saving every extra dollar he could. His boss noticed his skill and reliability and started giving him more responsibility. Before long, Ethan wasn't just fixing cars. He was managing projects, handling clients, and even training new mechanics. He realized that the very thing Claire had left him for, his lack of stability, was something he could build for himself. Not for her anymore, but for his own peace. Still, some nights the ache returned, like when a customer came in with a car that smelled faintly of her perfume, or when a song she used to hum played on the radio. It wasn't the kind of pain that broke him anymore. It was the kind that lingered quietly, a scar instead of a wound. Then one evening, months after their breakup, Ethan got an unexpected message. It was from a mutual friend of theirs, someone he hadn't spoken to in ages. "Hey, saw Claire at the gala last night," it read. "She's doing well. Seems happy." He stared at the message for a long time, unsure how to feel. Happy. The word felt heavy. He typed out a reply. "That's good," but deleted it before sending. What good would it do? She'd made her choice. And yet, as he sat there, a strange thought crossed his mind. Maybe it wasn't about her anymore. Maybe losing her wasn't the end of his story, but the beginning of something new. For so long, he'd defined himself by what he could give to her, by how much he could sacrifice to keep her. But now, for the first time, he started to think about what he could give to himself. He stopped working to impress anyone. Instead, he worked with purpose. He took night classes on auto design and business management. He saved relentlessly, cutting back on luxuries and focusing on building his dream. the one he'd once told her about by the lake, the small garage he wanted to own someday. Every paycheck, every project brought him closer to that dream. The transformation wasn't sudden. It was slow and quiet like healing often is. His co-workers noticed it before he did. He smiled more, laughed occasionally, even made plans outside of work. Rick, who had become something of a mentor, patted him on the back one day and said, "You're getting there, son. Sometimes heartbreak's the best teacher life gives." Years passed and Ethan's hard work finally paid off. He opened his own auto repair shop. Small but clean, with a big blue sign that read Cole's Custom Garage. The first day it opened, he stood out front, breathing in the scent of fresh paint and motor oil, the sound of cars humming in the background. It wasn't the glamorous world Claire lived in, but it was his, built from his sweat, his tears, and his resilience. Every corner of that shop was a reminder of how far he'd come. The office desk was secondhand. The tools were old but reliable, and the walls were lined with photos of satisfied customers. For the first time in years, Ethan felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Peace. Not the fleeting kind that comes from someone's presence, but the lasting kind that comes from knowing you rebuilt your life from the ground up. One evening, as he was closing the shop, he stood at the doorway, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold. He thought about her, not with bitterness but with gratitude, because if she hadn't left, he might never have found the strength to stand on his own. That night he whispered to himself, "I wasn't rich enough for her then. But I'm rich in something better now." It wasn't about money anymore. It was about self-worth, about knowing that his value wasn't tied to anyone else's approval. The pain had once defined him, but now it had shaped him. He didn't need Claire to see it. He saw it himself every time he looked around his shop, every time he fixed something broken and made it whole again. And though he never knew it yet, fate had a way of circling back. One day soon, their paths would cross again, and when that happened, she would see the man she had walked away from. But this time, he wouldn't be the one who wasn't enough. It was a bright spring afternoon when Ethan's past finally caught up with him. The sky was painted with streaks of gold and white, and the sound of city life buzzed faintly beyond the open door of his garage. The years had been kind to him. Or maybe he had just learned to carry his struggles differently. His shop was now thriving, with 3 employees under his supervision, and a reputation that had begun spreading beyond the small town. People came from other cities just to have their cars repaired by the guy who fixes anything. He stood by the counter, reviewing invoices, his hands stained faintly with oil as they had always been. It wasn't glamorous, but it was his. Every wrench, every dollar, every satisfied customer had come from his sweat. The boy who once couldn't afford to buy his girlfriend a fancy dinner had built something solid, something that couldn't be taken away. He'd learned that true wealth wasn't in the money you had, but in the peace you carried when you knew you'd earned everything with honesty. That's when the door opened, and the sound of heels clicked softly on the tiled floor. He looked up expecting another customer, and for a second his breath caught. Claire stood there, framed by the sunlight pouring in from behind her. She looked different, older, more polished, but somehow lonelier. The years had added an elegance to her face, but the spark he once knew was dimmer. For a heartbeat, neither of them spoke. Time seemed to pause, hanging between them like the faint scent of motor oil and perfume. "Ethan," she finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't sure you'd remember me." He smiled faintly, the kind of smile that carried both nostalgia and distance. "It'd be hard to forget," he said quietly. "You're standing in front of the garage I once told you I'd own." Her eyes flickered with recognition, then guilt. She glanced around the shop, taking in the clean workspace, the modern equipment, the certificates on the wall. "You did it," she said softly. "You really did it." "Yeah," he replied, wiping his hands on a rag. "Took a few years, a few mistakes, but I got there." For a moment, silence filled the air. Not the awkward kind, but heavy with everything left unsaid. She shifted her weight, her hands clasping her purse. "I heard about your business through a friend," she said. "They said you're one of the best in the state." I didn't believe it at first. He let out a quiet laugh. "Guess I had something to prove," he said. "Maybe not to you anymore, but to myself." She looked at him, and in her eyes there was something that hadn't been there before. Regret. Not the kind that screams, but the kind that lingers, quiet and endless. "You've changed," she said softly. "You look happy." "I am," he said simply. It took a while to understand that happiness isn't something someone gives you. It's something you build. Claire looked down, her voice trembling slightly. "I thought I was doing the right thing back then. I thought I needed more. Stability, comfort. But the truth is, I've never found it. Not really." Ethan listened, his expression calm, his heart steady. There was a time when those words would have broken him, would have reignited the fire of what-ifs and regrets. But now they only reminded him of how far he had come. "I know," he said quietly. "You made the choice that felt right for you." "We both did." She stepped closer, her eyes glistening. "I see you now, and I realize I gave up the only person who ever truly loved me for who I was. Not for what I had." Her voice cracked and she blinked away tears. "And I can't undo that." He looked at her, the woman who had once been his whole world, and for the first time he felt no bitterness, no anger. Just a quiet understanding. "We were young," he said softly. "We both wanted different things. You were chasing comfort. I was chasing dreams. Maybe it had to happen that way." Claire nodded, her shoulders trembling. "Do you ever think about us?" she asked, her voice fragile, almost afraid of the answer. "Sometimes," he admitted, "but not the way I used to. Back then I thought losing you was the worst thing that could happen to me. Now I see it was the beginning of something better. You taught me what I didn't want to become, someone who measures love by wealth." She wiped her tears and smiled faintly, though it was more of a surrender than joy. "You've become the man I always hoped you'd be. I just wish I'd had the patience to see it through." He took a breath, letting her words hang in the air. Then he said gently, "Life doesn't always give us second chances, but it does give us lessons. And I learned mine." Claire looked around once more, her eyes tracing every detail of the shop. "You're rich now, Ethan," she said quietly. "Not in the way I used to think mattered, but in the way that truly does." He chuckled softly, leaning against the counter. "Maybe I guess I'm rich in peace. Rich in knowing I gave my best, even when it wasn't enough for someone else." She smiled sadly, then reached into her purse and pulled out a small photo. The two of them, years ago, standing by his old pickup truck. She placed it on the counter. "I kept this," she whispered. "All these years." He looked at it for a moment before nodding. "Keep it," he said kindly. "That was a good memory. But it belongs to who we were, not who we are now." She hesitated, then nodded, slipping it back into her bag. "I should go," she said softly. "I just wanted to see you, to see what you became." He walked her to the door, the sun casting long shadows across the floor. As she stepped outside, she turned one last time, her voice barely audible. "Goodbye, Ethan." "Goodbye, Claire," he said, and this time it didn't hurt. He watched as she walked away, her figure slowly fading into the afternoon light. When she finally disappeared around the corner, he let out a deep breath and smiled. Not the smile of a man who had won or lost, but the smile of someone who had finally found peace with both. He turned back toward the garage, the sound of tools clinking and engines humming, greeting him like an old friend. As he picked up his wrench and got back to work, he whispered to himself, "I wasn't rich enough for her then, but now I don't need to be." Because in the end, Ethan realized something profound. Love that depends on wealth isn't love at all. True richness lies in the heart that keeps going, in the man who rebuilds himself after being broken. And though she had once left him for not being rich enough, she had unknowingly made him the richest man he could ever be. Rich in purpose, strength, and peace.